Sometimes, the most unexpected encounters shape our destiny. 3 lives, 3 stories, each bound by a twist of fate that changes everything. Story 1. The Forgotten Letter. Amelia Thompson had spent years restoring old houses, but nothing could prepare her for what she discovered in the abandoned Victorian estate on Willow Street. Hidden behind the fireplace, she found a yellowed envelope addressed to "My dearest Eleanor." Curious, she carefully unfolded the brittle paper and read a heartfelt love letter from a soldier named James, dated 1943. The words spoke of devotion, regret, and a desperate plea to meet one last time before he left for war. But the letter had never been sent. Determined to uncover the truth, Amelia dove into archives, tracing the names. What she found shattered her heart. James had died in battle, and Eleanor had spent her life believing he had abandoned her. Amelia was left with a question that haunted her. What if that letter had reached its destination? But then she made a shocking discovery. Eleanor was still alive, living in a quiet nursing home just outside town. With trembling hands, Amelia delivered the letter. The moment Eleanor read James' words, tears streamed down her face. "All these years, he loved me," she whispered. And just like that, a love lost to time was finally given closure. Story 2. The Passenger Who Never Left. Ethan Carter had driven the same night bus route for 10 years. He had seen all kinds of passengers: exhausted workers, drunken wanderers, lost souls. But one night he picked up a young woman in a red coat who changed everything. She sat in the back, silent, staring out the window. Every night, at exactly 1:47 a.m., she boarded at the same stop. But whenever Ethan reached her destination, she was gone, vanished as if she had never been there. Curiosity turned into obsession. Who was she? Why did she always disappear? One night he decided to confront her. As he pulled up to her usual stop, he turned to speak, but she was already gone. Shaken, he checked the security cameras. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. She wasn't on the footage. Determined to find answers, Ethan searched old newspapers. What he discovered left him breathless. A woman in a red coat had gone missing at that very stop, 50 years ago. And she was never found. Story 3. The Silent Melody. Music had always been Olivia's escape. A gifted violinist, she played in the subway every evening, her haunting melodies drifting through the tunnels. But one night, she noticed something strange. A boy, no older than 10, sat in the shadows, watching her intently. Day after day he returned, never speaking, never moving, just listening. Curious, Olivia approached him, but he simply shook his head and pointed to her violin. She played for him, and as the notes filled the air, something extraordinary happened. He smiled for the first time. A woman approached her one evening, tears in her eyes. "That's my son Daniel," she whispered. "He hasn't spoken since his father died. But he listens to you. Your music, it's the only thing that reaches him." Olivia's heart ached. She knelt beside Daniel and gently placed the violin in his hands. "Would you like to try?" she asked. He hesitated, then placed the bow on the strings. A single, trembling note echoed through the subway. And for the first time in years, Daniel looked up and whispered, "Music." That night, Olivia realized her gift wasn't just about playing, it was about healing. Story 4. The Silent Passenger. Samantha loved taking the late-night train home. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks, the dim lighting, the near-empty cars, it was her quiet sanctuary after long shifts at the hospital. One night, as she settled into her usual seat by the window, she noticed something odd. A man sat across from her, dressed in an old-fashioned black suit, hands neatly folded in his lap. His face was pale, his eyes distant, staring straight ahead. She hadn't seen him board. The train rattled forward, stopping at each station, but the man didn't move. By the third stop, unease crept into her. "Are you getting off at the last station?" she asked casually. No response. She glanced at the reflection in the window, and her breath caught. The man had no reflection. Heart pounding, she turned back, but he was gone. The seat was empty. The train pulled into her station and she rushed to the exit. As she stepped onto the platform, she caught sight of an old newspaper discarded on a bench. Her eyes scanned the front page and she froze. Mystery passenger vanishes. Train conductor reports seeing same man for 40 years. Below the headline was a blurry black and white photo. The man in the suit. The same one who had just been sitting across from her. Story 5. The Whispering Doll. Lena had always loved collecting vintage dolls. Porcelain faces, delicate lace dresses, each one had a story. But there was one doll she never remembered buying. It sat on the highest shelf in her room, its glassy blue eyes staring forward, lips frozen in a faint smile. One night, as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost like a breath against her ear. I see you. Lena bolted upright, heart pounding. The room was silent, the doll unmoved. She convinced herself it was just a dream. The next night it happened again. I'm getting closer. Terrified, she grabbed the doll and threw it into the attic, locking the door behind her. For weeks, the house was silent. Then one night she woke up with a start. A cold chill wrapped around her body. Slowly, she turned her head toward the shelf. The doll was back, sitting exactly where it had been before. And this time, its head was slightly tilted. A smirk on its porcelain lips. Then, in the dark, she heard it one last time. You shouldn't have done that. Story 6. The Man in the Keyhole. When Mira moved into her new apartment, the landlord had only one rule: never look through the keyhole of the locked room at the end of the hall. She laughed it off. Probably just an old storage space. But as days passed, she grew curious. Why was the door locked? What was inside? One night, unable to resist, she knelt down and peeked through the keyhole. At first, she saw nothing but a dimly lit room. Then a figure. A tall man standing in the corner, his back turned toward her. His posture was stiff, unnatural. A chill ran down her spine. The next morning, she asked the landlord about the room. He sighed, shaking his head. You looked, didn't you? She nodded. What did you see? A man, standing in the corner. The landlord's face paled. He took a deep breath before whispering. That room belonged to a man who lived here long ago. He wasn't normal. He had eyes that were completely red. Blood red. We locked the door after he disappeared, but some say he's still there. Mira felt her stomach drop. That couldn't be. She had seen a man, yes, but his eyes weren't red. She had only seen his back. That night, unable to shake her fear, she peered through the keyhole once more. This time all she saw was red. A deep, blood-red color filling the entire view. Then a whisper came from the other side of the door. I see you now. Story 7. The reflection that wasn't mine. Have you ever caught your reflection moving when you weren't? Sarah did. And it changed everything. It started subtly. A flicker in the mirror as she brushed her teeth. A shadow that didn't align with her movements. She blamed exhaustion, until the night it smiled at her when she wasn't smiling. She froze, toothbrush falling from her hand. The reflection didn't. It grinned wider. She stumbled back, heart racing, refusing to look. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. The next night, she watched the mirror from her bed. At exactly 3:12 a.m., it moved again. Her reflection stood up, though Sarah remained in bed. It pressed its hands against the glass, fingers leaving smudges that she knew weren't hers. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite hers, it whispered, "Let me out." Sarah screamed and covered the mirror with a blanket, vowing to never look again. But the next morning, when she cautiously pulled the blanket away, there were handprints on the outside of the glass. Story 8. The Whispering Room. Some houses hold echoes of the past. Some whisper secrets meant to stay buried. When Mark moved into his new home, he didn't expect it to whisper back. At first, it was a faint sound at night, a hushed murmur just beyond the walls. He convinced himself it was the pipes, the wind, maybe even his imagination. But then the whispers started forming words. Help me. Mark's stomach twisted. He followed the sound to the farthest room in the house, a small, windowless space at the end of the hall. The moment he stepped inside, the air grew thick. The walls sighed. He turned to leave. But the door slammed shut. The whispers grew frantic. He buried me here. Find me. Please. Mark's shaking hands searched the walls. One panel felt softer than the others. He pressed it and it crumbled away, revealing a hidden cavity, and inside, bones. A sickening realization hit him as he backed away, breath shallow. The whisper returned, softer now. Thank you. The room fell silent. But as Mark turned to leave, he heard something new. A whisper, not from the walls but from behind him. Now it's your turn. Story 9. The Man in the Reflection. They say mirrors are just glass and silver. But some reflect more than just your image. Some show you things you were never meant to see. Lisa had always felt uneasy around mirrors, but she never knew why. It wasn't until she moved into her new apartment that she understood. One night, while brushing her teeth, she looked up and saw something wrong. Her reflection was smiling. Lisa wasn't. She froze, heart pounding. Slowly, she turned her head left. The reflection didn't move. A cold sweat broke over her skin. She lifted a shaking hand, and her reflection lifted both hands. Lisa stumbled backward. The reflection didn't blink, didn't breathe. It simply watched. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it stepped forward. Not in the mirror. Into the room. The light flickered. The bathroom door slammed shut. And Lisa was never seen again. Story 10. The House That Whispers. Some houses creak with age. Others whisper with secrets. When Daniel and his wife, Sophie, bought the old Victorian house on the edge of town, they thought it was a dream come true. Spacious, historic, and just within their budget, it was perfect. At least until the whispers began. It started at night. A soft, unintelligible murmur drifting through the halls, too quiet to make out but impossible to ignore. Daniel dismissed it as the wind, the pipes, or even his imagination. But Sophie wasn't convinced. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the attic, Sophie froze. A voice, clear as day, whispered in her ear. "He's watching you." She spun around. No one was there. That night, she told Daniel, but he laughed it off. "Old houses make weird noises," he said. Then at 3:15 a.m. Daniel woke up. The whispering was louder now, almost frantic. He turned to Sophie, expecting her to be asleep. But she was sitting up in bed, eyes wide, lips trembling. "Daniel," she whispered. The voice, "It knows my name." A chill ran down his spine. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. They came from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. And then one final whisper came, clearer than all the rest. "Get out before he comes home." The couple fled that night, leaving everything behind. The house. It still stands. And if you listen closely, you might just hear it whispering. But the real question is, who was it warning them about? Story 11. The Reflection That Wasn't Mine. Mirrors show us our own reflection, or at least that's what they're supposed to do. For Mia, her bedroom mirror was just another piece of furniture. A tall, antique thing, slightly warped from age, standing silently in the corner. She never thought much about it, until the day her reflection stopped copying her movements. It started subtly. A blink that lasted too long. A tilt of the head that lingered even after she had straightened. Then one evening, as Mia was brushing her hair, she froze. Her reflection wasn't holding a brush. She dropped hers, heart pounding. The girl in the mirror smirked. Mia took a step back. Her reflection did not. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the reflection reached out, not toward Mia but toward the glass, pressing its palm against the surface. A dark crack slithered across the mirror. Mia ran. She didn't stop until she was out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. But as she backed away, panting, she heard it, a soft tapping from the other side of the door. The next morning, she covered the mirror with a sheet. She avoided her room as much as possible. But at night, she could still hear it. The faint sound of glass creaking, of something moving inside the reflection. One night, she worked up the courage to check. Just a peek, she told herself. She pulled the sheet away. The mirror was empty. She let out a breath, until she noticed something else. Her bed was reflected, but it was empty. Mia looked behind her. She was right there, standing in the room. But the mirror showed nothing but the furniture. Her reflection was gone. And then, from inside the glass, came a whisper. "Your turn?" Story 12. The House That Calls Your Name. Some houses are just old. Others are something else entirely. Lena had driven past the abandoned house on Hollow Creek Road hundreds of times. It was the kind of place people made up stories about. Kids dared each other to step onto the porch. Teenagers swore they'd seen lights flickering inside, even though the house had been empty for decades. Lena never believed the rumors. Not until the day it spoke to her. It was a cold autumn evening when she first heard it. She had been walking home alone when, from the direction of the house, came a whisper. "Lena?" She stopped dead in her tracks. The wind? A trick of her mind? But then, again clearer this time. "Lena, come inside." Her stomach twisted. The voice was soft, inviting. Familiar. She took a step forward without thinking. The house loomed in front of her, dark and silent. But something about the open door, she swore it hadn't been open a second ago, felt welcoming. Her feet moved before her brain could stop them. One step up the porch, then another. The door creaked wider, the inside just a yawning blackness. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her. Darkness swallowed her whole. Her breath hitched. She turned, fumbling for the knob. Gone. The door was gone. Then she heard them. The voices. Soft at first, overlapping whispers that slid through the air like fingers against her skin. They filled the space around her, whispering her name, giggling, calling. A candle flickered to life in the center of the room. Dozens of faces stared at her from the shadows. Some were pale and rotting, others just empty hollows where eyes should be. Their mouths moved, whispering her name over and over again. Lena. 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 She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her. One of the faces looked just like her. Story 13. The reflection that wasn't mine. Some mirrors show your reflection. Others show something else. Emma had always loved old things. Vintage clothes, antique furniture, anything with a history. So when she found an ornate, full-length mirror at an estate sale, she knew she had to have it. It was beautiful, tall, gilded, the glass just slightly warped with age. The seller practically gave it away, mumbling something about how it belonged in the past. Emma didn't care. She set it up in her bedroom, admiring the way it made the room feel bigger. That night, she woke up to a faint tapping sound. At first, she thought it was coming from her window. But as she sat up, she realized it was coming from the mirror. Her stomach twisted. The room was dark, but the moonlight illuminated the glass just enough to see her reflection. Except, she wasn't moving. Emma lifted a shaking hand. Her reflection did not. Cold fear crawled down her spine. She stared at the glass, heart pounding. Then the reflection smiled. Her own face, but twisted wrong. The mouth stretched too wide, the eyes dark and hollowed. A whisper filled the room, her own voice, but not quite right. Let me out. Emma scrambled backward, nearly falling off her bed. The reflection stepped forward inside the glass. Another whisper. Trade places with me? The smile widened. The reflection raised a hand to the glass and knocked. Emma bolted out of the room, heart hammering, slamming the door behind her. She didn't go back in until morning. When she finally did, the mirror was just a mirror again. Her reflection moved as it should. No smile, no whispering. But as she turned away, she could have sworn. Her reflection didn't. Story 14. The house that called my name. Some houses whisper in the wind. Others call you by name. Daniel had always been a skeptic. Ghosts, curses, hauntings. Just stories for the weak-minded. So when his friend dared him to spend the night in the abandoned Holloway house, he accepted without hesitation. The house had been empty for 30 years, ever since the Holloway family mysteriously vanished overnight. Some said they ran away. Others said the house took them. Daniel didn't believe in any of it. He packed a flashlight, some snacks, and a sleeping bag. By nightfall, he was inside, settling in the grand but decayed living room. The air was thick with dust and something else, something stale. By midnight, the house was silent. Too silent. No wind, no creaking wood, nothing. Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, he heard it. A voice. His voice. Daniel? He froze. His breath caught in his throat. It had come from upstairs. No one else was there. The voice called again, softer this time. Daniel, come here. His body moved on its own. His feet carried him toward the grand staircase, up the steps, deeper into the darkness. He reached the master bedroom. The door was slightly open, just enough to see inside. There was a mirror on the far wall. Tall, cracked, and in it, Daniel saw himself. But his reflection wasn't copying his movements. It was smiling. I knew you'd come. The reflection took a step forward, out of the mirror. The next morning, Daniel's friends came looking for him. They found his sleeping bag, his flashlight, his snacks, but no Daniel. The house was silent again. Waiting. And in the cracked mirror, if you listened closely, you could hear it. Come here.